Michael used public transportation almost every day, but he never thought he'd meet the love of his life on the bus. At the time, he was working in the steel mill, and often after a hard shift, he liked to sleep on the bus on his way home. Michael's coworkers would often push Michael by the shoulder to make sure he didn't miss his stop. Today, though, Michael was alone, and there was no one there to wake him. From the looks of things, Michael would have eventually ended up at the final stop, where he'd have to walk 30 minutes back home. But at that moment, a pleasant female voice plucked Michael from the sweet embrace of sleep. "Young man, it's time for you to get up, or you might miss your stop." Michael opened his eyes in surprise to see a beautiful girl sitting in the chair next to him. "Oh, thank you. How do you know what my stop was?" he asked in surprise. The girl burst out laughing and said that it wasn't her first time on the bus with them. She lived one stop after Michael, so she knew more or less when and where he had to get off. They exchanged a few words and felt an obvious affinity for each other. That evening, Michael stayed on the bus a bit longer to see his companion home at the next stop, who, as it turned out, was named Sarah. As they walked, they talked about everything there was to talk about, and when they parted, they arranged to meet up the next day. Sarah and Michael began to date, and 6 months later, they decided to get married. They were a beautiful couple, attracting admiration and pleasant smiles from passers-by. 2 years later, the loving couple had a daughter, Diane, who immediately became the meaning of life for the young parents. The girl's carefree childhood was tarnished only by the frequent illness of her mother, who for some unknown reason showed signs of lung disease. Usually, Sarah sought treatment at home, always postponing appointments for unspecified periods of time. "Sarah, I think you should see a doctor. How much longer are you going to suffer?" Michael said with concern in his voice. "Honey, how can I leave the two of you? I'd have to stay at the clinic for tests, and Diane is only 4 years old. When she's a little older, we can come back to this conversation," said Sarah as she tried to put on an upbeat tone to her voice. Perhaps if Michael had known where Sarah would end up with this kind of disregard for her health, he never would have agreed to postpone the doctor's visit. Trouble came to the Patterson family 1 month after the unfortunate conversation. On that fateful morning, Sarah felt lightheaded and dizzy. Deciding she could manage on her own, she continued to rummage around in the kitchen as if nothing was wrong. But by noon, her condition had worsened, and Michael had to call an ambulance. On the way to the hospital, Sarah slipped into a coma and was immediately admitted to the intensive care unit upon arrival. The doctors, trying to calm Michael down, assured him that everything would be okay. "Dad, is Mom going to be okay? Who's going to make pancakes and do my hair in the morning?" asked Diane, who decided to visit her mother the next day with her father. "Well, of course she'll be okay, honey," Michael answered, clutching a bouquet of his wife's favorite flowers in his hands. But when the father and daughter entered the lobby of the hospital, the nurse on duty stopped them and did not let them go further. A few minutes later, an elderly doctor came out and, taking Michael's hand trustingly, said, "Mr. Patterson, we are very sorry, but your wife died half an hour ago. We're sorry for your loss. There was nothing we could have done at this point. Treatment was sought too late, and most of your wife's lungs were infected with the illness already. Be strong." Michael did not hear the doctor's last words, for he was already halfway out the hospital doors, tossing the now useless bouquet into the nearby trash can. He cried softly, Diane by his side. "Daddy, Daddy, why are you crying? And where is Mommy? Why did you lie to me and tell me everything would be all right?" 4-year-old Diane asked anxiously. But Michael, trying to cope with the despair that overwhelmed him, did not know what to say to his daughter, who had lost her beloved mother half an hour before. After the death of his wife, Mr. Patterson, to his credit, did everything he could to ensure that his daughter did not struggle. The young widower worked overtime at the factory, eventually becoming one of the best employees there. One day, as Michael was taking the bus to work, a skinny, pale boy, about 8 or 9 years old, approached him. Curiously squeezing Mr. Patterson's hand, the little boy said, "Sir, please give me $30. I'm ashamed to ask you for money, but I'm really hungry." Michael looked into the eyes of the boy and saw the embarrassment and shame that was atypical of common street beggars and tramps. The man reached into his pocket and emptied out all he had. After giving the boy the money he needed, Michael smiled at the few cents he had left in the palm of his hand. Then, after thinking for a second or two, he took out the sandwiches he had prepared for his lunch break and gave them to the boy. "Take it, kid. See, I work at that factory. I'll get by." "Not the first time," Michael said, winking. "Thank you. I will definitely pay you back," whispered the boy with tears in his eyes. But Michael just smiled, patted him on the shoulder, and got off at the next stop. He had no idea that as the boy watched Michael leave, he made a vow to himself to find him and pay him back. Mr. Patterson did not regret giving the boy the last of his money, knowing that he needed it more. That evening, Michael walked home from work hungry, having only consumed a glass of water for lunch. The boy who had asked him for money was named Tony, and he genuinely didn't have anything to eat, as his parents led a wild lifestyle and often abused alcohol. 10 years flew by without a trace. Thanks to his persistence and determination, Michael's salary at the factory doubled. Mr. Patterson bought Diane a bicycle to make her happy. The teenager was over the moon and spent all her free time riding with her friends through the shady alleys of the park and the streets around her home. One day, trying to outrun her classmates, Diane lost control and hit the curb, sprawling across the pavement. To the surprise of her peers, the girl could not get up on her own, and so bystanders had to call her an ambulance and then tell the sad news to her father. "Doctor, tell me, what's wrong with my daughter? Is it dangerous? Is she going to be okay?" asked Michael, who had taken a day off from work when he heard about his daughter's accident. "I can give it to you plainly. At the moment, Diane's life is not in danger. Her health, though, that's another matter. Unfortunately, the girl has a broken spine, and she will most likely not be able to walk again," said the doctor, struggling to find the right words. But after seeing the grief-stricken father's reaction to his words, he added, "That doesn't necessarily mean all hope is lost. There are clinics at the other end of the country where other treatments are used for injuries to the musculoskeletal system. Unfortunately, though, these operations are very expensive, costing from 5 to 6 figures. Where am I going to get that kind of money?" Mr. Patterson muttered, clutching his head. But the doctor only shrugged his shoulders and headed for the staff room. Diane was discharged from the hospital a month later. Now it was up to the girl to learn how to use a wheelchair and get used to living the life of a handicapped person. Several more years passed, during which Michael Patterson tried to raise the money needed for his daughter's surgery. By this time, Diane turned into a real beauty and would have easily taken the title of Miss America if it weren't for the wheelchair. Having unsuccessfully tried to raise funds for the treatment of his daughter, Michael Patterson slipped into a depression and had already lost faith in anything good coming out of his endeavor. And when it seemed that there was no hope for help, there came a knock at the door of his house. When the door opened, the owner saw a handsome, well-dressed young man who looked about 30 years old on the doorstep. "Hello, Mr. Patterson. You probably don't recognize me," the stranger smiled. In response, Michael shook his head no. The young man then drew several bills from his pocket and held them out to Michael. When Mr. Patterson took them in his hands and counted them, a sweet smile spread across his face. He understood everything and automatically slipped the $30 into his trouser pockets. Michael remembered what had happened 20 years ago when he gave a boy $30 on a bus before treating him to sandwiches. Apparently, that boy was standing in front of him now, only 20 years older. The young man introduced himself as Tony Perez and asked to come in. At that moment, Diane appeared in the living room in her wheelchair and, smiling sweetly, greeted the visitor. Tony was a little embarrassed and turned red, and then he pulled himself together and asked how Mr. Patterson was doing. The fellow had not forgotten how the man had given him the last of his money 20 or so years ago. That's why when he finally made his way in the world and became a businessman, he decided to seek out the noble man. All this time, Mr. Perez had been living in a neighborhood state, and had only come to Arizona to fulfill a promise he made 20 years earlier to pay back a debt. Tony remembered his benefactor worked at the plant, so when he contacted the personnel department, he found the address he needed. But the guy didn't expect a troubled man with a disabled daughter at all. When Tony heard about Diane's illness and the possible solutions, he thought for a moment and then said, "Mr. Patterson, many years ago you saved me from the death of starvation. At that time, those $30 were more important to me than some 30,000 or even 3 million now. That's why I'm deciding to pay you back for that and cover all of Diane's treatment costs." After the young businessman's words, there was a still silence in the room. Then Diane and Mr. Patterson, one after the other, began to shower Tony Perez with gratitude. Tears welled up in the eyes of the young businessman as he recalled his 9-year-old self asking for money from a man he didn't know. He kept his promise, and 3 weeks after the successful surgery, Diane took her first steps on her own. During that momentous event, her father stood on one side and Tony Perez stood on the other. Tony fell in love with her and intends to marry her soon. For the first time in years, there were tears of joy, not grief, in Mr. Patterson's eyes. And according to him, these tears were far more pleasant than tears of sadness and longing.